So this is lifespan development. We're going to talk about some of the theories. We're going to talk about the development, especially at a biological and then a social interaction level. We're going to talk about those components and then also the cognitive level. So let's talk about theories of development. We're going to start with our very good friend, Sigmund Freud. Now, Sigmund came up with some early ideas about how we developed. Most people are not very fond of these, but it's important to understand, and they actually are used in some ways for us to understand maybe how individuals get to different aspects with disorders later. So if you're interested in what disorders or therapy are for different mental health disorders, knowing some about Freud's theories could be helpful. So when we think about Freud and what he was talking about, he identified all the way up to puberty, different developmental stages. There are 5 primary stages, or the core of them are going to be the oral stage. And this is the early stage when children are exploring their world primarily by putting things in their mouth, a piece of dirt, a block, any of those kinds of components. And then the anal stage, and this is about potty training. It's the component that leads into how they manage those parts of their body that they are still trying to find control over. And this is an aspect that he thought was part of how we develop in our life. And then he saw this move to a phallic stage, which is about our sexual organs. And for him, he was very male-centric, and so he chose the phallus as that component. And so that in this point in development, both for males and females, Freud thought that all of the development focused on the penis and the role that it played in a sense of identity and power, and in that females would be jealous to not have those components. And these are really some of the core reasons why people these days are not very fond of the way he shaped his theory and don't agree. And then after all of those 3 stages are moved through, he led us into this idea of this latency, where some of those core motivations are suppressed, and then we just go into this playful aspect of life. And you'll see this more in grade school time. And then comes puberty, the genital stage, where again, everything is changing in our body and our identity is being shaped by these different developmental changes that are so visible in that stage of life. Neo-Freudians came along and removed a lot of that sexual focus on the development from Freud's focus. Erik Erikson was one of the primary motivators for us looking at this, and he gave us these stages that are a part of our developmental component all the way through to old age and death. And so he took all the way to that adolescent component where Freud stopped at puberty and gave us a way of thinking about how development continues. What he was working on is understanding the social nature of humans, how we interact with our world, and the identity that's being formed in the shaping of those components. He came up with 8 key stages for us to understand. So the key ones are all of them. You need to know all of them as you're understanding Erikson's perspective. And this does play a role in understanding some of the crises that individuals would be maybe experiencing tied to different stages in their life. So some theorists then have translated this into the therapy that they would work on. So the first stage is going to be in that first year, and that's going to be trust versus mistrust. And that's where babies have to learn that they can trust their caregivers. This is what Erikson proposed. Next would be autonomy versus shame and doubt. And that's that whole, can I do it myself? And small children, by myself. They want to tie their shoes, they want to put their coats on, they want to do things by myself. And that's that autonomy versus shame and doubt. The third one is 3 to 6 years, and that's going to involve initiative versus guilt. And that's this moving into creating all sorts of art projects, putting shapes and things together to create. And that is a developmental stage. So the idea that in these stages is that they have to achieve the developmental component so that they can move on. If they don't, they're going to have a stilted development in the rest of the stages. After stage 3 of initiative versus guilt is industry versus inferiority. So more creating, and at this point it may be really adaptive creating, or it may be just volume. And I know a lot of parents end up with so many drawings coming home from their kids and there's no more refrigerator space for it. So that can be that aspect of industry versus inferiority. And then comes identity versus confusion. And this is what we in the United States or Western cultures think of as adolescence. So 12 to 18 is this like, who am I? And that aspect of trying to form an identity, typically as they separate from their identity being so tied to their family. And then after that is, according to Erikson, is intimacy versus isolation. And again, this is pretty Western centric in these regards in terms of early adulthood, so 19 to 29, although I would say those years have extended some. They used to be a little shorter and now they're going into their 30s, depending on how culture is reinforcing when we partner up or how our culture even defines what partnering is. In the past, it would be getting married, starting a family, and those components. And so intimacy versus isolation. Are you going to go it alone, or how can you build those solid foundational relationships for the next stages of life? The middle years of adulthood, 30 to 64, are going to be generativity versus stagnation. And again, this is pretty Western-centric, this idea that you're supposed to build your life on whatever your career is, build your family, raise them, and now you have this product to say, this is what my life has been about. This is meaning-making. After those years, Erikson suggested that individuals go into what is integrity versus despair. The question of, did I live well? Is there anything to show for all of those years that I put in? So these are Erikson's 8 stages. He saw that they were developmental in terms of they were discrete. The first one had to be accomplished before the second one could be entered into with any hope of success. And we see that in this, there is a frame, and there's certainly evidence to support that this may best explain some developmental aspects. So we've talked about Freud, we've talked about Erikson. Those are primary theorists in terms of kind of that whole identity piece and those aspects. Now we need to understand that Piaget was core to the cognitive understanding. Now Piaget held power in our understanding of this for so long. There are some individuals that have challenged some of the ways that he described things. And I would say that his research was a little bit biased because his primary subjects were his own 2 children. And he's a bright man, so he probably had children that were also quite bright, which is going to taint the research. Remember back to that chapter on how we do good research? Yeah, pretty much cannot take data from your own children and assume that's going to relate to the rest of the world exact. However, he did give us some good understanding, and it's helped us kind of recognize ways that we can go about how people develop cognitively. So 2 components that absolutely have held their ground that Piaget introduced to us are assimilation and accommodation. And this has to do with how we learn information. So assimilation is we bring in this information into our existing frame of how we understand it, or our schema of the world. And you can think about this in terms of a small child sees a 4-legged creature walking along, and they have been told that 4-legged creatures are doggies. They're like, that's a doggy. No, that's a kitty. Now they have to take assimilation, and then they have to accommodate, change aspects of their schema or their frame to now have 2 different kinds of 4-legged creatures that walk. One is now a dog and another is a cat. Now they're similar, but not exact. So we assimilate information, then we gather more understanding, and we accommodate for this new information and how it helps us understand our world. This is not just for children. We do this assimilation and accommodation throughout our life. It is the way that we take in new information. It also helps us understand a little bit about biases and prejudices. So if you think about that, you have a frame, a schema, and you've built that based on past experience. New information comes in, and that schema is only going to let stuff in that's going to have some sense making. And prejudices come when we do not allow for new information to come in so that we can maybe change, accommodate our own old ways of thinking. This is why we have people that have stuck points that we call biases or prejudices. Piaget has 4 primary areas that he describes in terms of stages of cognitive development. There's a sensory motor, there's the pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. So sensory motor, that's what babies are doing. They're just using their sensors to understand the world, not just their hands. All of their senses are how they're taking in, assimilating new information. And what we see in the very smallest of children is that they sleep all the time. They also eat all the time, and they make messy diapers all the time. But their early stages are actually limiting the information as they gather their ability to take in more and more information. So their learning goes through this sensory motor framework for how they understand. It's the world through the senses. And then we move into, from ages 2 to 6, a pre-operational component. And this is where words have, your vocabulary grows so much between 2 to 6. We actually learn the majority of our vocabulary from ages 2 to 6, at least the vocabulary we tend to use. And that is where we understand logic and reasoning. If I do this, then that happens. And you see children like building with blocks, and then what happens if I push the blocks over? And those kinds of components. And they check to see if it happens by doing it over and over again. So we see repetitive play, and you might from your age go, why do they keep doing it? Because they're learning if the rules are the same every time. This is a pre-operational way. There's a lot of pretend play, learning about roles, how people interact. There might be dress up kinds of components related to that, talking about the things they see modeled in front of them. Say you see little boys and little girls, little children role playing out marriage and having children and all of those aspects. That is part of this pre-operational age group. The concrete operational ages are from 7 to 11, and that's where they understand this more at these concrete events. And they're beginning to understand analogical, like in their brain, how can I think about this without actually having to do it? So the role playing now is becoming more abstract in how they engage the information. In this, there's a lot of opportunity for mathematical understanding. I have a great story about my son when he was little, when he figured out that 4 quarters would get you this paper dollar. And he figured out how to get 4 quarters by going up to his dad's side of the bed, dad's bed, and pulling all the extra quarters off of dad's dresser and bringing them down and exchanging those 4 quarters with his dad. For the paper dollar dad had. Now, it didn't take his dad too long to figure out that he was just replacing his own quarters for that money. And my son was at the right age where he got that these 4 quarters equaled this dollar. But the next step was these weren't his to begin with. So there was some other aspects to that understanding of the whole scheme of things. Now let's talk about Kohlberg. And Kohlberg introduced this idea of moral development. So I just told you about my son and the quarters. Now the other thing that was going on at that same time is that my son was maybe not fully consciously aware that those quarters were not his. And so he was actually taking money that wasn't his and exchanging it for money that he now had as his father gave that to him. So what we see with Kohlberg's ideas is, when does the morality play into that? When my son was confronted with that, when he was asked, where did you get the quarters? He was honest and was able to acknowledge, from your dresser. And he knew at that point, when asked the question, this is not right. And he gave all the money back. But at that point, there was now like, oh, now I also have a moral question. And Kohlberg introduces this whole aspect. He gives us a frame of understanding how development happens in our moral aspects. So small children don't have that complex thinking about what my decisions have to do and how they affect other people. They are only about what is going to affect them. And we see in Kohlberg's way of conceptualizing this is pre-conventional morality. This is what happens in those early years about it's about me, it's about getting what I need. So that's where children might take a toy and they don't understand how that was wrong to take it from another child. that it's about them. Whereas the next level, level 2, would be conventional morality. It's more about, oh, there are right rules. We understand, like my son figured out, oh yeah, that's not my money. And he acknowledged he was right into developing that conventional morality and knowing that it's not okay to take things that are not yours. He was learning that within our family system. The next level is going to be post-conventional morality. And this is a much larger way of thinking. And not everybody actually operates at that level. And this is where we kind of recognize there's a social contract. How we make our decisions, how we choose to live affects other people. And so the questions that we work with at this level of morality is, how can I make good decisions that are good enough for me and also good enough for others? This is hard work at a moral level. And Kohlberg noticed that a lot of individuals have a hard time getting to this level. It's very common that this is going to be in your 20s and beyond, because there's so much other stuff going on at a physical and cognitive level that has to happen before you can start conceptualizing a larger world. All right, now we're to stages of development. We're going to talk about how babies happen. Well, not all of it. We're only going to talk about the prenatal development and then how they continue to develop at a physical level. So that's where we're headed, and then we'll work our way all the way through adulthood and the development that goes into that. So when you're first looking at how does a human baby get created, you probably know this. The germinal stage is the first 2 weeks of germination, and that's where the ovum, the egg, is going to meet up with the sperm, and one of the sperm make it through, and now we have fertilization. There's that very quick development in those first 2 weeks where that zygote, who is a one-celled structure, does a lot of mitosis or cell division, and then a zygote, as more cells are developed, grows into and starts forming all of the different parts and organs of what will become a human baby. It is a beautiful miracle. After those stages, we now get into weeks 3 to 8, when this small cellular creature is growing in through the embryonic stage. And this is where it starts looking more and more like a human. This zygote has multiple cellular structures, and it is working its way into developing the connection with the mother's blood system so it can have good support in terms of health. That is going to be the placenta. That's the structure that attaches to the lining inside of the uterus and starts building the interface with the bloodstream from the mom, where all of the nutrients are going to be provided for the further development, and then all of the rest of the care for processing any of those components that embryo is processing on out. You would know that with that placenta, the umbilical cord is what's tied to that. And your umbilical cord is what gets clipped off or clamped off and creates your belly button. By the way, how they tie it is not whether it's an innie or an outie. I don't understand what makes it an innie or an outie. That's probably not part of general psychology. The next stage is the fetal stage, and this is weeks 9 during pregnancy all the way to weeks 40. Human pregnancies are 40 weeks long, and technically they're really only 38 weeks long, but you'll learn all about that later. The reason that's so long is that we don't know usually when conception happens, but actually 38 weeks from conception to birth is pretty typical. But we have to go back a couple weeks so that we can really do the counting, and that's why we get 40 weeks. During these last weeks, from week 9 to week 40, all of the rest of the development happens. This is where we have the basis of the human, but it has to be built out. It's so small, and it has to grow in strength and in structure. So we have the beginning of the neural components, but you need more brain than that to be able to function, especially outside the mother. You have some beginnings of limbs, and both arms and legs and the rest of the organs are going to be finished out. The last few weeks are going to be more of that, like just basically fattening up and strengthening up the lungs in their ability to be able to transition from the amniotic fluid to actually breathing air and the oxygen in processing that's in our air. So all of these are the components that make up what we call the fetal stage. When you think about those 40 weeks or those 38 weeks, you want to understand that there are a lot of things that can influence the development. That's what this chapter is about, that's going on for that child. Now, certainly there can be genetic components that are part of the sperm and the egg and how they got together, but mother's nutrition, the stress or other components that are going on in their environment as that mother and that child are navigating those 40 weeks, all of those are very strategic in whether it's providing the healthiest or really a stressed environment for the development. Additionally, just how that mother cares for herself is going to be important. This is why we want pregnancies to be identified early and early health care to be involved in that. One of the things that happens during that fetal development is there's the possibility of teratogens. Teratogens are any of those components from the environmental side of things that may be agents that impair development. And we know that some medications actually are those teratogens. And so if someone is trying to get pregnant, they may intentionally go off of certain medications so they don't compromise the development of that child. Certainly alcohol is one teratogen that we know about, and individuals that have had prolonged exposure during the fetal development are going to have, depending on how frequent and the mother's processing of that, could have very severe impact from alcohol, smoking, also other drugs and components. Now, the question with smoking, with other drugs, often is, do we know if that's the only teratogen, or is some of it also impacted by the stress of the environment, or maybe the nutrition that is impacted because of using cigarettes or using other drugs? A lot of times nutrition is compromised because there's just not the same kind of interest in eating that might be a part of that, or sleeping in those components. Well, we've looked at teratogens just a little bit. There's a lot of other ones that you would want to be aware of if you were wanting to study that component, or you are helping someone who is thinking about getting pregnant or is pregnant know how to take care of themselves well. But now let's talk about a newborn. This child is now born. Now we've got to look at how healthy are they? What's going on? What are the components that are here? We actually look at children, and there's something called an APGAR test that is used to determine the strength and the viability of that newborn. What do they need? What kind of assistance they need? And in that test, they're going to explore different components like color and heart rate and their ability to breathe. But they're also going to look at what we see as reflexes. Newborns have specific reflexes. They, if they get rubbed up against their cheek, they do something called a rooting reflex, where they go towards that because that's just an innate component that helps them to latch on to a nipple so that they can get their food, their nutrients. Additionally, they have that sucking reflex. We don't typically have to teach a newborn how to suck. It's just an innate thing. And if we do, that's a challenge because you have to teach someone how to eat. Also, there's a grasping reflex. You'll see new parents, oh, look, this child is holding my finger. Well, no, they're grasping. They aren't really holding your finger or your hand. They're just grasping because that's a reflex. Now, it does become intentional over time. There's other reflexes, and these are all things that help us understand, was the development effective for this child? Are there any kind of other impairments? And that's really helpful for us. Remember, we're looking at normal development versus maybe things that are outside of the norm, because we want to understand if we need to do any interventions to help support the development of this child. So when we think about physical development in humans, physical development is so rapid in those early months, weeks, years. They change, and some parents will go, wow, they don't look anything like they did when I left them this morning. Things change. It slows down around age 4 or 5, and they tend to kind of stabilize into pretty stable leg, arm length, and the ways that they look. This is kind of their small version of what's probably going to adapt. Later on, there's going to be more physical growth. The rapid flux for females is going to show up between 8, 9, and you're going to see some height changes, and then moving into other aspects of moving towards adolescence, puberty, and that's usually going to show up by age 12. And then males are going to have that just a little bit later, usually 2 to 4 years, and you're going to see their rapid development, similar kind of movement forward, but delayed a little bit. When we think about the nervous system and what's going on in this small infant child, you're going to see all sorts of you wouldn't. If you looked at their brain, you'd see all sorts of neural pathways, so many things. And some of the things that we look at is like they have all sorts of potential. They do, but all those neural pathways, and many are growing rapidly even after they're born, but there's so many that they're going to cross. They're going to get in the way. And so what happens after that, as they start to learn new information from their sensory motor information, they're going to prune away the unnecessary neural pathways so that they can focus on the ones that are most important. So we get a whole lot of opportunity, and then we find the components in our brains that are going to be most effective for the sustainability of that individual. You don't have a lot to say. It's part of what your body does naturally. Your size of your brain actually increases in the frontal lobe all the way up until age 6 in significant ways. Some of the cognitive developmental components that are important to understand, remember we have the normal. Between 6 to 9 months are some key components. Small babies should be able to shake their head no at that point. They may not have the verbal components to it, but they have the no, and they have meaning attached to it. From 9 to 12 months, they have verbal requests. They may wave goodbye or ask to be picked up, and they frequently will have some sort of word, may not be super clear, but a word that goes up or me, any of those kinds of components. One of the things that shows up usually by age 9 months is what we call object permanence. And the important component to that is that it helps a child understand that when a caregiver, a mom or a dad or other caregiver is present and then they leave, they still exist outside of the visual here. And when they come back, it's still the same object. Peekaboo is part of this. Playing hide and seek and peekaboo helps to reinforce this idea of object permanence. And you can tell that a child has object permanence when you hide something from them and they go and remove that to see if the object is underneath. And that's an important adaptive component for the future. If you have a cared loved one in your life and every time you leave, you thought they disappeared and didn't know if they were coming back, that could cause a great deal of distress. So object permanence is a part of that component, and it's adaptive for the rest of life. Some of the cognitive milestones that you'll see from age 3 to 5 years are going to focus on colors and counting and knowing their name, understanding some of those labels that can help them in terms of age and what they like to do. We already talked about role playing or pretend play. This is real prominent from age 3 to 5. From 6 to 11, it's going to be that more logical component. There's going to be a lot of organization. From 6 to 11, you may see a lot of collections, a lot of like stamp or rock or those kind of collections. It's about ordering and understanding and finding ways to maybe develop preferences that are part of how they work in their world. There's a lot of cause and effect, a lot of that science of if I, then this. That's part of that age time. Now we're going to talk about psychosocial development and attachment. Attachment is so key, and we know that it starts actually before a child is born. Infants recognize the sounds that they hear while they're in the mother's uterus. So music or voices that are really familiar, you'll see even after birth, they respond to them as in a different way than they will with unfamiliar sounds. They will turn to voices that they recognize. And those are some components that we see are so essential in terms of attachment. Attachment provides a sense of I know who I am and I know who others are. And what we see in those early stages is attachment to the familiar. When we look at attachment, there are key theorists that have been so instrumental in this. So we have Harry Harlow, John Bowlby, and Mary Ainsworth are key components that gave us the understanding of how attachment forms, how it can be problematic, and how parents play a role in it. Specific to Harry Harlow, he did a research experiment that would no way be allowed in these days and ages because of the ethics that we now understand regarding the role that science plays. But he took some monkeys and these were baby monkeys, and he wanted to understand what kind of caregiver they needed so that they continued to thrive. And he gave options for them in terms of one that would provide the nutrients and one that would provide more comfort. And what he found is that while they do like their food, their preference was for tactile comfort. This is one of the things that we have then looked at into how that plays a role in the attachment that human babies have. When we look at what happens for individuals that are kept in orphanages, especially in orphanages where there may not be a lot of tactile comfort, but just food provided, we see that development is impaired for these individuals. And this is so strategic so that we can figure out how to do interventions, both if they are removed from those orphanages or early on in other situations. If you have a parent who is having trouble wanting to spend time with their small infant, those are things that we want to work with. How can we build more connectedness? How can we build the behaviors that reinforce that this is a child that is cared about, not just in their physical needs, but also in their emotional and cognitive needs? Bowlby added to this research in terms of understanding the theory that there is this sense that children, especially in those first 3, 4, 5 years, need a secure base. They need a place where they know that who they are is cared about. It's not something that has to be earned. It's because they are. This is the best foundation that small children can have, and it helps them then to navigate the world beyond. If they always have a place where they know there's a parent that loves them, that is what Bowlby gave us in terms of understanding what is attachment. We long to be loved for who we are, cared for who we are. And then Mary Ainsworth added to this, helping us understand that there were different ways that we have attachment. So it's not just attached or not attached. So there are insecure attachments, there are secure attachments, there are avoidant attachments, there are disorganized attachments, and maybe even resistant attachments. So when you think about how a child is going to navigate this parent, and we don't know all of the pieces that go into every parent-child relationship, but a secure attachment will be that I know my parent loves me. I know I can count on them to be there to support me in these ways. Whereas an anxious one may be about, I don't know, they may not always be there. It feels like it's always a question. An avoidant is they haven't been there, or I don't want to count on them, and so there's a withdrawal. Now, one of the things that Ainsworth came up with is that if these are the kinds of attachments we develop in our early life with our primary caregivers, these are likely the things that are coming into our future relationships with friends and further on with more in-depth, intimate relationships, where we may bring that kind of secure or insecure avoidant component into how we relate to key people in our life. This is why this research has been critical to us understanding, so that we can understand psychosocial development past childhood and into adulthood. Certainly related to attachment are different parenting styles. We're not going to go into the depths of those, but understanding that how parents set up their ways of running their family can reinforce or undermine attachment is something to consider, especially as you may consider being a parent in the future. This leads us to adolescence. Adolescence is such a transformative situation, but want you to understand that adolescence is not a part of every culture. It's much more Western-centric, as we understand that we have provided a place for young children to maybe have a little safe kind of exploring before they have to go out on their own. Other cultures may take them straight from childhood into those more adult responsibilities. But in Western communities, that's not how we do it. We have this time period of adolescence. Defining when it is a challenge. We know it starts usually around the time of puberty. So there's this physical marker. We've usually indicated the age is around 12-ish, but that's going to be give or take depending on the individual and the gender. So there's some of those components. Things that are going to be signs of puberty, you're probably familiar with, but it's going to be developmental and definitely related to the hormones that are changing the body from a child to more of an adult form. At the same time, there's physical development and changing in the brain. Actually, your frontal lobe changes quite a bit during puberty. There's some rearranging and you get much more access to abstract thinking. This is why some of the math that we do later on in like middle school or high school times would be very hard for earlier ages to grasp because it requires such an abstract component. Geometry, trigonometry, calculus, all of those are challenging concepts to grasp before you have that frontal lobe adjustment and development in this area. With this whole brain change is also an increase in the ability for cognitive empathy. That idea that I can understand what it's like to be in another person's situation is expanded. It's not that it's not present before this, it's just not as accessible. It's not the first or the easiest to get to until you've had some of those brain changes. Also in your adolescence, as Erikson had said, this is that identity or role confusion. And so there's a lot of who am I, where am I headed? If you're thinking about college seriously, which is why you're probably taking this class, part of that question is, who am I? Where do I want to go? Why am I taking this class? How will this help me in the future? All of those are components of how you transition from adolescence into emerging adulthood. As we get into emerging adulthood, there's even more of that definition of who am I and where am I headed. And there's still some physical development, but most of it is done. What we do see is that most females are going to be pretty physically done with their development, maybe some adjustments depending on how they care for themselves over life. And then if they have children and carry children through pregnancies, that can adjust it. But it's not the same kind of developmental component. Whereas males are going to have some more development. That's their brains actually do more of the development all the way to like age 25, whereas females tend to be a little more finished a couple years prior, but they're also seeing some physical changes, and you may see young men that are graduating high school as pretty slim and maybe not as broad-shouldered or filled out, and then when you see them like 5-10 years later, that has changed and they've moved into a fuller frame. That's pretty common too. At a cognitive level, it's also going to be an interaction with their environment. They have the capacity, now they have to exercise it, and that's that interaction. And then we're going to move on into that regular middle ground that Erikson would have called middle age. And in that area, we see that there's this generativity component, and what we find is that there's crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence. We talked about this earlier. If you learn enough to do your job, you have to decide you're going to be a lifelong learner, and I would be one that would advocate for lifelong learning. But our crystallized information, that stuff that we know, tends to get us through the day, the week, the month, sometimes the year. It's not going to keep us in that experience of feeling generative throughout our life, though. That's going to require ongoing learning, a fluidity to how we engage our world. And that leads us to the sense that as we age, relationships are critical. Relationships help define identity, help to define what we're contributing, certainly with family, but also with peer groups, social support, our engagement in our community. All that plays a role. As we get to the end of life, we are going to be faced with who is it? What did I give my life to? What meaning do I have? And those are some of the challenging questions that we probably face throughout life, but become more prominent as we know we're ending our life. Now, life has a cycle that these days, I think the stats would say most of us are going to make it into our 70s and our 80s. It depends on a lot of factors, but if we have that many years, you're going to start thinking more about that end of life stuff as you get into your 50s and 60s. And then the question is, How do I want to end? What legacy do I want to live? One of the things that's a challenge in a culture like the United States, where there are so many different cultures represented, is that endings are not consistent. In fact, when a person dies in our country, there's no clear idea of how we mourn or how we process the death, what ceremonies we have, a memorial, a funeral, or how we even navigate those. Those are very culturally structured, and I think that one of the things we see in the United States is that people struggle to even question, what is that? Why do I want to look at that? Because they don't have a culture informing them how to do that. Also, there's questions, what might happen after I die? As a Christian, that may be something you've already resolved. And those are hard questions for people to understand, but all of that plays a role as we enter into thinking about, how is this going to end? And having conversations about that is going to be helpful. We don't live in a culture that embraces conversations about death and dying, but it is something that helps us to finish well and finish this life well. And I certainly encourage you to be someone that doesn't wait, but starts those conversations soon. Your family will benefit from it, and you will benefit from it too. Make your life from birth to death something that you can say was done well. This is Lifespan Development.